By the early 1880s, the metropolis had swollen into a leviathan of steel, steam, and stone, pulsating with an energy that was as intoxicating as it was predatory. The harbor, a forest of masts and smokestacks, funneled a ceaseless tide of humanity through the Golden Door. They came from the famine-stricken hamlets of Ireland, the fractured principalities of Italy, the shtetls of Eastern Europe, and the crumbling empires of the Old World. They arrived with their possessions tied in bundles, their names often anglicized by weary clerks, and their hearts burning with a singular, blinding hope: the American dream. Into this chaotic amphitheater stepped George C. Parker, a man who would come to define the dark underbelly of that dream. Born on March 16, 1860, to Irish parents in New York City, Parker was a native son of the pavement. While his parents had navigated the hardships of the immigrant experience, escaping the grim prospects of Northern Ireland for the teeming tenements of New York, George was a product of the city's next evolution. He was not content with the survivalist mentality of the first generation. He was ambitious, articulate, and possessed a rare advantage for a man of his background: a high school education. In an era where literacy was a privilege and higher learning a luxury, Parker's education armed him with a dangerous weapon: the ability to speak the language of the elite while understanding the desperation of the street. Parker's early life remains a study in contradictions. He began his professional life legitimately, working in real estate. It was here, amidst the deeds, titles, and transfer taxes, that he likely experienced his epiphany. He saw how the abstract concept of ownership was defined by pieces of paper, documents that were revered as sacred talismans by those who had never owned land. He realized that the value of a property was not in the soil or the brick, but in the belief of the buyer. If he could manufacture the belief, he did not need the property. The New York of Parker's youth was a city of stark dichotomies. To the north, the Vanderbilts and Astors were constructing palaces of marble that rivaled the Chateau of France. To the south, in the Five Points and the Lower East Side, families slept in shifts in airless rooms. This visible disparity fueled a hunger in the newcomers that Parker learned to exploit with surgical precision. He understood that the immigrant greenhorn was not stupid. They were simply uninitiated. They were navigating a world where the rules were opaque, where opportunity was the watchword, and where trusting the wrong person was a rite of passage. Parker's transition from legitimate real estate agent to the king of conmen was likely gradual, fueled by the realization that the legitimate path was too slow for his appetites. He began to curate a persona that would become his most valuable asset. He was no longer the son of Irish immigrants. He was a man of consequence. He adopted the dress and demeanor of the ruling class: the starched collars, the tailored waistcoats, the heavy pocket watch that ticked with the authority of money. He frequented the docks and the arrival centers, not as a predator lurking in the shadows, but as a benevolent captain of industry basking in the sun. His early scams were the scales on which he practiced his art. He sold small, non-existent lots in the burgeoning suburbs to families desperate to escape the crush of the city. He sold the rights to plays he had never read, let alone owned, but these were petty thefts, unworthy of his growing ego. Parker looked at the skyline, at the monuments that defined the city's identity, and saw something different. He didn't see public works, he saw inventory. He saw the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Statue of Liberty, and Madison Square Garden not as cultural treasures, but as assets on a balance sheet that only he controlled. The genius of Parker's approach lay in his understanding of the immigrant psychology. These new arrivals were fleeing feudal systems, dictatorships, and rigid class structures where power was absolute and ownership was hereditary. The United States was sold to them as the land of the self-made man, a place where a commoner could become a king of commerce. When Parker approached them, dapper and confident, claiming to own a landmark, he was validating their deepest hopes about America. Of course, a private citizen could own a bridge. Of course, he could sell it. This was America, where everything was for sale. As the 19th century wound down, Parker's operations grew in sophistication. He began to use aliases to fragment his identity, staying one step ahead of the nascent police forces. He was James J. O'Brien, a name that sounded solid and reliable to the Irish cops and politicians of Tammany Hall. He was Mr. Roberts, the efficient bureaucrat. He was Mr. Taylor, the wealthy investor. He even adopted the persona of Warden Kennedy, a role that suggests he may have dabbled in scams involving the legal system itself, perhaps selling promises of parole or protection. But these were merely rehearsals for his magnum opus. The city was growing taller, bridging the rivers that had long constrained it, and spanning the East River, rising like a Gothic cathedral of wire and stone, was the structure that would become synonymous with Parker's name. It was the Brooklyn Bridge, the eighth wonder of the world, and George C. Parker had decided it was time to put it on the market. The winter of 1908 had settled over Brooklyn with a vengeance. The wind whipped off the East River, cutting through the thickest wool coats and turning the breath of horses into clouds of steam. Inside the Raymond Street Jail, however, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp stone, and the coal smoke from the potbelly stoves that fought a losing battle against the chill. George C. Parker was a resident of this grim fortress, incarcerated for one of his earlier, less successful ventures. By this point in his career, Parker was a known entity to the corrections officers. He was not a violent thug or a desperate junkie. He was a gentleman criminal, a man of wit and stories who posed no physical threat. This reputation had earned him the status of a trustee, a privileged inmate allowed to move relatively freely within the administrative sections of the jail to perform menial tasks. It was New Year's Day, and the holiday spirit had penetrated even the gloom of the jailhouse. The discipline of the guards was relaxed. The rigorous protocols of lock and key were softened by the camaraderie of the season. Laughter echoed from the guardroom, and the vigilance that usually defined the perimeter was dulled by the distraction of celebration. Into this relaxed atmosphere walked Sheriff Flaherty. The sheriff was a newcomer to the position, a man perhaps still adjusting to the weight of his office and the cunning of the men he was sworn to keep. He had just arrived from the biting cold outside, his face flushed, his movements stiff from the freezing temperature. Seeking relief, Flaherty entered the jail's administrative area, a zone where Parker was currently working. With a sigh of relief, the sheriff shed the heavy layers of his authority. He unbuttoned his thick woolen greatcoat, the brass buttons catching the dim light. He removed his official sheriff's hat, the symbol of law and order in Kings County. Carelessly, perhaps distracted by a greeting from a subordinate or the promise of a warm drink, Flaherty placed the coat and hat on a chair or a rack near the entrance. He then turned away, walking deeper into the office, leaving the garments unattended. Parker, sweeping a floor or organizing papers nearby, watched this sequence of events with the intense, predatory focus that had served him so well on the streets. He saw the coat, he saw the hat, he saw the guards, their backs turned, engrossed in a story or a joke, their attention momentarily severed from their duty. In the mind of George C. Parker, the calculation was instantaneous. There was no hesitation, no agonizing over the risk. This was not a plan hatched in the dark of a cell over months of whispering. It was an act of supreme improvisation, a masterstroke of opportunity. He understood better than anyone that clothes make the man. In that coat, he would not be inmate 123. He would be the law. Parker set down his broom. He did not look around furtively. To look guilty was to be guilty. He stepped toward the chair with the easy, entitled gait of a man who owned the room. He reached out and picked up the heavy coat. He slid his arms into the sleeves, the wool still warm from the sheriff's body. He buttoned it, hiding his prison fatigues. He picked up the hat and placed it squarely on his head, pulling the brim down just enough to shadow his eyes, but not enough to look suspicious. He turned toward the heavy iron door that separated the jail from the street. the membrane between captivity and the chaotic freedom of Brooklyn. His heart must have been hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his face was a mask of bored, bureaucratic indifference. He was George C. Parker, the greatest actor of his generation, and the stage was set for his exit. He walked toward the door. He reached for the handle. To comprehend the sheer audacity of selling the Brooklyn Bridge, one must first understand what the bridge meant to the world in the early 20th century. Completed in 1883 after 14 years of grueling construction that claimed the lives of 27 men, including its designer John Roebling, the bridge was a triumph of human will. It was the first steel-wire suspension bridge in the world, its neo-Gothic granite towers rising 276 feet above the water, dwarfing the church spires of Manhattan. For the millions of immigrants processing through Ellis Island, the bridge was often the first structure they saw that rivaled the grandeur of the Europe they had left behind. It was a symbol of permanence, of connection, and of the limitless wealth of the New World. For George C. Parker, it was simply the ultimate prop. From the late 1890s through the 1920s, Parker made the sale of the Brooklyn Bridge his signature con. He did not approach this haphazardly. He approached it with the rigor of a corporate takeover. He would scout his locations carefully, identifying marks who appeared awestruck by the structure. He looked for the butter and egg man, a colloquial term for a wealthy, naive businessman from the rural Midwest, perhaps flushed with cash from a successful harvest, looking to make his mark on the big city. He also targeted the industrious immigrant patriarch, the man who had saved every penny and was looking for a legacy to leave his children. Parker's setup was elaborate. He would often rent temporary office space near the bridge, furnishing it with heavy oak desks, leather chairs, and maps of the city, creating an atmosphere of officialdom. He employed accomplices who acted as clerks or secretaries, bustling about with papers to create the illusion of a busy administrative hub. But the centerpiece of the con was the documentation. Parker was a master forger, or at least he knew where to find them. He produced deeds that were masterpieces of the printer's art. Heavy bond paper, embossed gold seals, intricate watermarks, and signatures that flowed with authoritative flourishes. These documents explicitly transferred the title of the Brooklyn Bridge from the current owner, sometimes the city, sometimes Parker himself posing as the builder's heir, to the victim. The pitch was seductive in its logic. Parker would approach the mark, perhaps standing on the pedestrian promenade, gazing out at the Statue of Liberty. He would strike up a conversation, introducing himself as the owner. He would explain with a weary sigh that owning such a massive structure was a burden. The maintenance, the politics, the headaches, it was too much for one man. He was looking to liquidate. He wanted to retire to a quiet life in the country. Then came the hook, the tolls. In the early years of the bridge's operation, pedestrians were indeed charged a penny to cross and livestock and carriages paid more. Although the pedestrian tolls were repealed in 1891 and roadway tolls in 1911, the memory of them, and the concept of toll bridges, was deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. Parker would convince his victims that the city was mismanaging the toll collection, or that the rights to collect tolls were part of the sale. He painted a picture of passive income, a toll booth that acted as a money-printing press, collecting coins from the thousands of commuters who crossed daily. The price was fluid. Parker was a master of reading people. If he sensed a mark was wealthy but skeptical, he might ask for $50,000, over $1.5 million in today's currency. If he was dealing with a simpler man with limited means, he might let the bridge go for as little as $75, framing it as a charitable act or a distress sale. He sold the bridge repeatedly. Legend suggests he sold it as often as twice a week during his peak years. The transaction would conclude in his fake office. The money would be exchanged, cash, always cash, and the deed would be handed over with a solemn handshake. Parker would wish the new owner luck, perhaps offering a piece of advice on how to manage the toll collectors, and then he would vanish. The aftermath was a tragic comedy that played out on the bridge itself. The victims, clutching their deeds and often accompanied by hired laborers, would march onto the bridge to take possession of their property. They would begin to erect wooden barriers or toll booths, blocking traffic and demanding payment from confused New Yorkers. The scene is easy to visualize. A bewildered immigrant from Italy or a stubborn farmer from Indiana, waving a fancy-looking paper at a carriage driver, shouting that this was his bridge. Traffic would back up, horns would honk, and inevitably the NYPD would arrive. The officers of the NYPD became wearily familiar with the scam. They would have to explain to the owner, often through a language barrier, that they had been swindled. "You can't buy public buildings," the police would shout, dismantling the makeshift toll booths. The realization would wash over the victim slowly. The money was gone, the kind gentleman was a ghost, and the eighth wonder of the world belonged to everyone and no one. While the Brooklyn Bridge was the crown jewel of his criminal empire, George C. Parker's ambition was not limited to a single borough. He viewed the entire geography of New York City as a menu of opportunities. If a building had a name and a front door, Parker believed he could sell it. His versatility was astounding. He sold the Metropolitan Museum of Art, likely pitching it as a private gallery that had outgrown its original owner. He sold the original Madison Square Garden, the architectural masterpiece designed by Stanford White. In this scam, he presumably convinced investors they were buying the venue's box office rights or the building itself, capitalizing on the city's voracious appetite for entertainment. He even sold the Statue of Liberty. This required a more nuanced approach. Since one could not easily set up a toll booth in the middle of New York Harbor, Parker likely sold the scrap rights or concession rights to the statue, anticipating the scam Victor Lustig would later use to sell the Eiffel Tower. He would spin tales of government neglect, claiming the statue was to be dismantled or privatized, and that the buyer was getting in on the ground floor of a salvage operation. But perhaps his most psychologically manipulative scam involved Grant's tomb. The resting place of Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero and former president, was a site of pilgrimage and national reverence. Parker would loiter near the monument in Riverside Park, adopting a somber, melancholic demeanor. When a tourist approached, Parker would introduce himself not as a businessman, but as the general's grandson. With tears in his eyes, he would weave a tale of family tragedy. He would claim that the Grant family had fallen on hard times and could no longer afford the upkeep of the tomb. The government, he would whisper conspiratorially, had abandoned them. He was forced, with a heavy heart, to sell the monument to a private investor who would promise to care for it. He preyed on the patriotism and empathy of his marks, who would refuse to help the family of the man who saved the Union. He produced forged family letters and documents to authenticate his identity, selling the tomb to those who believed they were performing a patriotic duty. To juggle these various scams, Parker maintained a Rolodex of identities. He was James J. O'Brien, a solid Irish Catholic name that garnered trust in a city run by Tammany Hall. He was Mr. Roberts. He was Mr. Taylor. He was William McClondy. Most brazenly, he used the alias Warden Kennedy. This persona suggests a deep cynicism about the legal system he constantly evaded. Posing as a prison warden, he may have sold fake pardons or promises of protection to the families of incarcerated men, or used the title simply to intimidate victims into compliance. He also used the alias I.O.U. O'Brien on checks, a cheeky, arrogant wink at his own criminality, practically daring people to catch him. He was also a land swindler of the more traditional variety. In one instance, he sold Max Schmeyer 10 lots of land that he did not own. When detectives finally caught up with him for another crime, they found him in Asbury Park, New Jersey, measuring a backyard. Even as the cuffs were being placed on him, Parker reportedly told the police that if they hadn't arrived, he would have sold the place for $17,000. Parker's success was not just due to his acting ability. It was due to the information gap of the era. There was no internet, no centralized property database accessible to the public, and no easy way to verify a deed. Trust was a currency, and Parker was a master counterfeiter. By the late 1920s, the world that had created George C. Parker was vanishing. The roaring, chaotic energy of the turn of the century was being tamed by bureaucracy, modernization, and a more professionalized police force. The Wild West atmosphere of New York real estate was being regulated. Parker himself was aging. The dapper, energetic man who had charmed butter and egg men was now in his late 60s. He was balding, pudgy, and relied on round-framed spectacles to see. The sharp wit was still there, but the physical vitality was fading. He was described by reporters as looking old and tired, like a meek lamb or retired stockbroker. The legal environment had also shifted drastically. The state of New York, tired of repeat offenders revolving through the justice system, had enacted the Bohm's Laws. This was a precursor to modern three-strikes legislation, mandating an automatic life sentence for anyone convicted of a fourth felony. The era of the charming rogue getting a slap on the wrist was over. Parker's downfall did not come from a grand $50,000 bridge sale. It came from a moment of petty desperation, or perhaps carelessness. On a cold day in 1928, using the alias William McCloundy, Parker wrote a check for $150, roughly $2,600 today. The check was worthless. It was a small score, likely just enough to cover living expenses or debt, but it was a felony. He was arrested and brought before the Kings County Court in Brooklyn. The courtroom was packed with journalists who knew his legend. They watched as the man who had sold the Statue of Liberty stood before Judge Alonzo G. McLaughlin. Parker did not fight the charges. He pleaded guilty to grand larceny in the second degree. The tragedy of the moment was palpable. Detectives who had hunted him for years testified to his character with a strange mix of respect and pity. One detective was quoted as saying, "He's one of the smartest men I've ever met. He might have been a judge or a doctor," noting that Parker could have gone far if he hadn't been too lazy to use his mind in the right direction. But the Bohm's Law allowed for no mercy. This was Parker's fourth felony conviction. The judge had no discretion. On December 17, 1928, the gavel came down with the finality of a tombstone. George C. Parker was sentenced to life imprisonment in Sing Sing prison. The man who had sold the city was now owned by the state. We return now to the door of the Raymond Street Jail, January 1, 1908. George C. Parker, clad in Sheriff Flaherty's oversized coat and wearing the sheriff's hat, turned the handle. The heavy door groaned open, revealing the street and the guards stationed outside. The guard turned, expecting to see the sheriff leaving for the day. He saw the coat. He saw the hat. He saw the posture of a man in command. The guard did not ask for identification. He did not peer beneath the brim of the hat to see the prisoner's eyes. Instead, conditioned by the symbols of authority, the guard snapped to attention and salaamed, an exaggerated, respectful salute to the man he believed was his superior. Parker nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture appropriate for a sheriff in a hurry, and walked past him. He stepped out into the biting cold of Brooklyn, a free man. He had escaped prison not with a file or a tunnel, but with a hat and a coat. It was a story that would be told in speakeasies and police stations for decades, the day George Parker walked out of jail because he simply looked like he belonged outside. But in 1928, there would be no escape. Parker was transported to Sing Sing Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison that was a far cry from the Raymond Street Jail. Sing Sing was a hard place housing the worst of New York's criminals. Yet, even here, Parker thrived. He did not wither into obscurity. In a twisted way, Sing Sing became his final audience. He was enormously popular among both the inmates and the guards. He was a celebrity, a relic of a golden age of crime. He was known as Warden Kennedy by some, a mocking tribute to his aliases, or simply as George. He spent his final 8 years holding court in the yard or the mess hall, regaling rapt audiences with tales of his exploits. He told them about the Italian family who tried to build a toll booth. He told them about the hick who bought the bridge for $500. He told them about the time he cried fake tears over General Grant's grave. He was the bard of his own life, ensuring that his legend would outlive his incarceration. George C. Parker died in Sing Sing in 1937. He was buried, likely in a pauper's grave, but he left behind a legacy that is stitched into the fabric of American culture. He is the reason for the idiom that every American knows. When a deal sounds too good to be true, when someone displays a breathtaking lack of skepticism, the ghost of George Parker is invoked. If you believe that, the saying goes, I have a bridge to sell you. It is a phrase that serves as both a punchline and a warning, a reminder of a time when a man with a smile and a forged deed could sell the impossible to the hopeful. Parker may have died a prisoner, but in the lexicon of the American English language, he remains immortal. The man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge and the man who taught a young country that the only thing more dangerous than a lie is the desire to believe it. The story of George C. Parker is not just a story of crime, it is a story of capitalism in its rawest, most unregulated form. It is a story about the commodification of trust and the capitalization of hope. And, as long as there are people willing to believe that they can get something for nothing, the spirit of George C. Parker will be standing on a street corner somewhere, deed in hand, waiting for the next buyer to walk by.